Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The global economy stands at a crossroads, caught in the crossfire of an escalating tariff war that's shaking markets and rattling confidence worldwide. Just last month, the IMF slashed its growth forecast, signaling deeper trouble ahead as trade tensions between the U.S. and China flare up and ripple across the globe. As for South Korea, an export-driven powerhouse, the stakes couldn't be higher, facing stalled growth, soaring risks, and tough choices ahead. So on Within the Frame tonight, we hear from Danny Leipziger, professor of international business and international affairs at George Washington University, who was also the former vice president of the World Bank, for a clear-eyed view on how this trade battle will shape the world economy and what it means for Korea's future. Welcome to the program, Professor Leipziger.
Glad to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. So let's start right away. Like I've said, last month, the IMF has revised its global economic growth forecast for this year down from 3.3 to 2.8%. This reflects concerns over, President Donald Trump's tariff policies. Professor, how would you assess the current state of the global economy?
Well, I think the global economy is struck by a very high level of uncertainty. And I think whenever you have that kind of uncertainty, it reduces consumption, it reduces investment, it makes everyone nervous, and that's not good for economic growth. So I believe that the downgrade by the IMF is totally understandable. And the longer the really high tariff threats persist, the longer this uncertainty will dominate, and that's going to be very bad for a lot of economies, including South Korea.
Definitely. So the IMF downgrade actually highlights real concerns about global growth amid these trade tensions. Then, Professor, not really long after his inauguration, U.S. President Donald Trump has been pursuing tariff policies as a means to address America's debt problem. As an economic expert yourself, what is your take on this approach by U.S. President Donald Trump? And do you believe tariffs can positively contribute to debt management?
Well, I'm not sure I agree that his motivation is related to the management of debt. I believe his primary focus is to gain tariff revenues so that he can provide some tax benefits for the wealthy. And I think the new bill that's in the Congress reflects that concern. I think his second motivation is sort of a 19th century view of trade, in which trade imbalances are all bad. I think that's contrary to what most economists would argue. And in fact, the U.S. Has benefited tremendously by being able to sell its government paper. And some countries will have surpluses, some will have deficits. The real issue there is whether the surpluses in trade with the U.S. are caused by intervention by the government or it's just market forces. So I don't believe that debt management is the primary concern of the Trump administration.
Right. So other than debt management, there are more priorities for President Trump. Now, the U.S. and China, after a prolonged tariff war, recently struck a dramatic agreement to each reduce tariffs by 115 percentage points through trade negotiations. Though this has definitely alleviated some uncertainty in the global economy, there still are concerns about a potential recession. What's your outlook on this regard, Professor?
Well, I think the ability of the U.S. and China to begin talking is definitely positive. I wouldn't read too much into it. I mean, the initial tariff levels were exorbitant on both sides. So putting a halt to that for a period of time is useful. Where these negotiations will end up is harder to say. I mean, the Trump administration in its first inception was very keen on punishing China. And I think that motivation coming from the fact that the administration believes that China is subsidizing its exports and doing damage to global trade by controlling critical minerals, et cetera, means that I think the battle between the U.S. and China will continue. So this is a useful step to de-escalate, but I wouldn't read that much into it. I think we actually have to see where the two parties come out after some serious talks.
Right. So while the tariff has reduced some, uncertainty, there still are underlying risks to it. Then, on top of that, Washington and Beijing has also agreed to a 90-day mutual tariff suspension, and this leaves room for speculations that the tariff war is not yet over, like what you've just mentioned. In your view, what are the most important factors in ensuring that both sides adhere to this tariff agreement?
Well, I think we'll see what emerges. I think it's too early to really see what the contours of that arrangement might be. China does have some significant non-tariff barriers, and the U.S., I think, feels that China has been misbehaving in certain sectors, be it in steel or aluminum or others. So I think some of these key areas need to be dealt with. But then I think we have the longer term problem, which is dealing with technology transfers, artificial intelligence, electric cars, et cetera. And I think it's inevitable there will be competition between the first and the second largest economies in the world. The question is, are there some rules on how that competition proceeds? Or are we in this sort of Wild West world in which, I put big tariffs on you and you retaliate? I think, if China were pursuing its industrial policies and were the size of, Paraguay or another small economy, I don't think the global economy would suffer and we wouldn't care. But given that China is the second largest and growing still rapidly, I think how it behaves and how the U.S. behaves is just very important for global stability and for global trade.
Right. So coming up with a really definite rule and having trust with both sides, mutual trust would be also important. Professor, let's also touch upon South Korea's economy. A recent report by state-run Korean think tank forecasts that this year's economic growth for the country would stand at 0.8%, citing sluggish exports and weak domestic demand, also caused by the tariffs. In the past, you've previously emphasized that South Korea is relatively open export markets as part of its growth strategy. So considering the current global trade conditions, how would you view this sub 1% growth forecast now?
Well, I think it's certainly below Korea's potential growth rate that the IMF would put forward, which is above 2. I think the drop in GDP growth can be attributed to a number of factors. Certainly, global trade uncertainty is one of them, but I don't think we should underestimate domestic factors. I think there's been an unprecedented amount of domestic uncertainty and concern. You have an election coming up in a couple of weeks. And I think that, consumers, when faced with uncertainty, reduce their spending. And I think the same is true for investors. So I think there are some issues in Korea, and you know them fairly well. I think in the long term, we're talking about demographics and fiscal challenges. I think in the medium term, we're talking about the fact that Korea is stuck with a security arrangement with the U.S. and a lot of economic ties with China, which puts it in a very vulnerable position. And in the short term, we have the tariff problem and what that means for economic growth and the operations of many of the major chaebol. So I think there are short-term issues around trade, there are medium-term issues around the relationship between the U.S. and China, and there are long-term issues having to do with demographics. So all of these things lead to the possibility of lower growth in the future. And I think that's not something that is very convenient given the demographics of Korea, in which it's going to be harder and harder for the working population to support the non-working population. So a growth rate below 1%, obviously concerning.
Right. Now, as we've been touching upon trade, as we spoke, the South Korea's trade talks, working level officials from South Korea and the U.S. held a second technical meeting in Washington on tariff issues a few days ago. As negotiations begin to gain traction, it's likely that the contents of the so-called July package will be left to the next Korean administration. Professor, what kind of strategic approach do you think South Korea's new government should take in trade talks with America?
Well, it's a very good question. I think the first issue is that I wouldn't leave it to the new administration to set the parameters of these negotiations. I think that's why you have good negotiators and good technocrats who can lay the groundwork. Yes, it has to be endorsed by the new administration, but I think a lot of work has to be done before then. In terms of how to deal with the U.S. on this issue, I think we have seen now the trade agreement between the U.S. and the U.K., so that gives us some lessons for how to deal with the administration. But it also has to take into account the fact that the U.S. trade deficit with Korea has more than doubled between 2021 and 2024. Now it's, I believe, in the range of 55 billion. So for an administration that views these bilateral deficits as a concern, I think the negotiators will have to find some ways to bring that Korean surplus down. And I think there's some things out there having to do with increased purchases, perhaps, of agricultural products, of Boeing aircraft, and even some investments in LNG. There's been some discussion about this Alaska pipeline. So I think the U.S. administration likes to show big wins. The strategy for the Koreans is to allow the announcement effects of these big wins to carry the day while actually negotiating things that make sense from the vantage point of South Korea.
Right. So we should take lessons from previous deals with other countries and also expand areas of cooperation in different industries as well. Now, beyond external factors like, declining exports due to tariffs, what about domestic risks in the Korean economy? What do you think is the Korean economy? What kind of risks do you think the Korean economy is facing domestically? You previously pointed out that the aging demographic and a shrinking workforce pose significant challenges. Could you assess the long-term impact of these issues?
Well, I believe, yes, the long-term impact is that it will put a greater fiscal burden on government. And so the question there is some further redesign of pensions required? Something need to be done in the tax system? There's some issues that are longer term. But given the demographics, we know exactly what Korea's population will look like 18 years from now. So these are things that I've written about in the past, and I think Korean officials were aware of. It's just each administration feels that they can pass it on to the next and not deal with these issues. So I think that's the long-term challenge. I think the immediate concerns, if there are any, for me, are more in the area of the housing issue. I think, again, Korea's household debt as a proportion of, disposable income is among the highest in the OECD. 2/3 of the mortgages are still floating rate, which makes them more vulnerable and uncertain. And it makes the life of the central bank more difficult because, their main objective is to fight inflation and have financial stability. But there's also this concern about the housing market. So I think, for a new administration coming in, obviously they're going to have to deal with trade as the first agenda item. But I think that there are some other structural issues having to do with the way the housing market functions, and the way that fiscal policy is structured, given the demographics, that a responsible administration should be tackling.
Right. So as you've mentioned, South Korea's household debt is definitely at an all-time high. With U.S. Maintaining high interest rates, how do you think this combination could threaten South Korea's economy specifically? And what kind of solutions could you suggest in this area?
Well, I think at the moment interest rates are still reasonably high. I don't think we know exactly what the Federal Reserve is going to be doing over the course of the next 6 to 12 months because of this great uncertainty having to do with trade and the global economy. So if it turns out that the tariffs push inflation up in the U.S., which is not unlikely, then the Fed would want to keep rates very high and tight. If, on the other hand, the global economy suffers more than the IMF projections, and the U.S., is in recession, then it places a great challenge on the central bank in the U.S. Do they fight inflation? Do they fight recession? But to your point, I think interest rates in the U.S. have some impact on interest rates in other countries. But I think basically the central bank, the Bank of Korea, has done a good job in dealing with inflation and setting rates at a level that deters inflation but doesn't cause great distress in debt markets or in the housing sector. So it becomes more complicated, but I think you have a very capable governor, and I think he'll be able to manage that. I believe the trade issues are perhaps more dominant in terms of risk factors than are the monetary policies in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. So we've been touching upon trade, household debt, and South Korea's demographics. Professor, what about beyond this, beyond the issues that have already been discussed? What kind of other risks do you think we should be paying close attention to in the current economic environment?
Well, I think, honestly speaking, one of the things that I think countries should avoid are self-inflicted wounds. Now, obviously, in the U.S., with the current administration, we are inflicting a lot of wounds on ourselves. That's unfortunate. But when we turn to South Korea, we see that divisive politics over the course of a number of years has made it more difficult for Korea to deal with the challenges that we've been talking about. It's very hard to deal with the trade issues, fiscal issues, housing, whatever, when you have two parties that would like to spend most of their time attacking one another rather than dealing with some of these concerns. So my concern in terms of risk is that the continuation of this strife between the two major parties will be at the expense of the Korean economy and the Korean people. I think that uncertainty and backtracking on policies is really detrimental. And Korea is in a good position. However, as I mentioned, it faces these challenges, the short-term challenges of the tariff war, the medium-term challenges of relying on the U.S. for security and China's trade, and then in the longer-term demographics. So all of these things, short, medium, and long-term, require governments that can forge some sort of consensus and use perhaps bipartisan commissions or committees to try and move the agenda forward on some of these structural problems in a less politicized way. So I think the big challenge for Korea right now, it may well be internal.
Right. That seems to be a critical point. All these policies center on, of course, the government and the legislative body. And let's hope for the next government to support these kinds of policies as well. Now, before we let you go, Professor, drawing from your experience at the World Bank, what would you believe should be the top economic policy priority for South Korea's incoming administration?
Well, I think what I just said, the political economy issue is number one for me. And I have not been very optimistic about how policy is being made because of this internal stress. So whoever wins, I think the first challenge is to try to force some sort of cohesion between the various factions so that Korea can more effectively deal, A, with the tariff issues with the US, and B, with some other structural considerations, such as the fact that the China market is changing and China is trying to be much more self-sufficient, which means that there's going to be less trade going in that direction. The issues having to do with critical minerals and metals is really important. And then the issues of fiscal policy. So I think that many of these things are manageable. They won't disappear, but they're manageable. But they're only manageable if the technocrats are supported by the political forces. I think that once you take issues and politicize them, and we've seen this in the US, we've seen it in France, we've seen it in the UK, many economic problems become much more difficult to solve when you have this political debate that is quite unhealthy and really is quite divorced from the kinds of policy actions that are required. I think you have good think tanks, you have good ministries, you have people that know what should be done. The problem is they can't get through the National Assembly when the two sides just don't want to play ball with one another. And I should say, coming from the US, I understand this because we've had this kind of political gridlock before. But I think in the case of Korea, it's even more urgent that the parties begin to see that they're supposed to work in the national interest and do so in a more cooperative and collegial way.
Right. So it all returns back to better governance and also less political wrangling, of course, to better support and push through with these policies. But I'm afraid we'll have to conclude our discussion at this point. But thank you so much for your time and for making time for us and for your insights tonight, Professor Leipziger. We appreciate it so much.
It's been my pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.